Welcome to Ouch. Was that a ghost? This podcast may contain graphic material, which some listeners may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised.
Help me.
Now that we covered that, here's your host, Liz.
Welcome back, everyone. Hope everyone's having a great 2024. Happy New Year's. And to make this less awkward and less scary for me, I'm just jumping right in with no banter. Today, I'm going to be covering the Salem witch trials, one of the most notable cases of mass hysteria. In 1692, over 200 people were accused of practicing witchcraft, and contrary to what many believe, there was no burning at the stake in Salem. This was more of a European thing. Europe saw any crime involving witchcraft as a religious crime, and if you were found guilty of heresy, then burning at the stake would be the punishment. The English government even hired a witch finder general, which, by the way, women couldn't be burned under English law in Salem because basically burning their clothes off would leave them naked, and that's not cool. So let's quickly go over some of the ways you could be accused. You could be accused if you were a female, you were too poor, too rich, you had friends, you fought with friends, you disagreed with anyone, you were too old, too young, if you were a healer, because if somebody was giving herbal medicine at the time, and a person was getting healed, and then that person stopped giving medicine, they looked at it as you were a witch, not that you were just withholding medicine that was helping the person. If you got married and didn't have enough children, you could be a witch. Your neighbors aren't getting pregnant because in their mind, you're a witch stealing their baby. If you have any type of stubborn behavior, if you have a mole, a birthmark, you're a witch. Which, imagine being put through that. How gross is that? You're standing, probably being examined by a whole bunch of old men looking at your naked body. They were also looking for a third nipple or anything that could be mistaken for a teat. They were also checking for lactation, which some of the women that were accused were pregnant. If your butter or milk spoiled, you could be a witch. If the cows in town aren't producing enough milk, then you're probably a witch. If you had sex outside of marriage, that's grounds for being a witch. And if you broke any rule in the Bible ever, then you could be a witch. If you tried to figure out who your future husband would be, then you were probably a witch. So now you know how to spot a witch. And all of these things that I've listed were reasons given in the trial of Salem. The trials officially started in February 1692 and ended May 1693, and a lot of things happened during this short period. It started in a settlement called Salem in Massachusetts Bay Colony, which Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded in 1628, just to give you a little timeline, which was established mostly by a group of Puritans that fled from England. A quick little backstory. Henry VIII, who I'm sure everyone is familiar with because of the songs and all that, but he had an English Reformation, and he changed the state religion from Catholicism to Protestant Anglicanism. I can never say that word. Most say this was done to give him the ability to divorce instead of just chopping his wife's heads off like he had been doing. Either way, doing this forced the people to choose. Do you want to convert or do you want to leave? And the Puritans, the Protestant Christians, were the ones that decided to leave because they wanted to believe what they wanted to. They didn't want to be forced into his beliefs. So they started coming to America and settling and trying to figure everything out in a brand new land. And this was a British colony, so it was ruled by English law. To understand the trials, you have to understand what life was like back then. This was 17th century Massachusetts, and people lived under the fear that the devil was trying to destroy them at every corner and their whole village. You have to put yourself in the mindset of the villagers. They were strictly devout. Superstition and spiritual fear guided their actions. Puritans believed that everyone was predestined for heaven or hell, and worrying about this was the most important part of your day. Anger, envy, bad thoughts could all be signs that you were destined for hell. They thought of themselves as being one collective soul. One weak-minded person could damn them all, and they were constantly living in fear of satanic influence. There wasn't just Salem, it was split into two areas. Salem town, which was established in 1626, was where the merchants lived and the wealthier. And then there was Salem village, which was established 10 years later in 1636, where the farmers lived. They did not particularly care for each other. But because religion was their whole life, they were forced to tolerate each other because there was only one church, and it was located in Salem town. Historians point out how a lot of the accusations came from people in Salem village, which was the northern, towards the people that lived in Salem town, the southern, because the people from Salem village seemed to think that they were purer, I guess, closer to God. So in 1672, Salem village was like, we need our own church. And according to historian Emerson Baker, 22 years was the average time for retaining a minister. Salem village went through 4 different ministers in the matter of 16 years, just to show how disagreeable the community was. The first minister being James Bailey from 1673 to the second being Reverend George Burroughs from 1680 to 1683. He'll come back later. The third was Minister Vedette Lawson from 1684 to the fourth in that 16-year period being Reverend Samuel Parris, who joined the congregation in 1888 or 1889. I've seen both. He was the first reverend in Salem village that was formally ordained, so he could give communion. Prior to this, the other 3 could not. So the people of Salem village still had to maintain a connection with Salem town to receive communion. Reverend Samuel Parris was an Old Testament, fire and brimstone kind of reverend, and the village loved it. He pointed out any and all flaws. It didn't matter your social status. It didn't matter. Everyone was fair game. He did not tolerate spiritual weakness, and he strongly encouraged tattling on anything and anybody. This was a group of strongly God-fearing people living in near isolation in a brand new world, which, side note, they were still stealing from the Native Americans, but that's a whole nother story. But having this fear, the smallest accusation when you're already so much on edge, could have factored into how this took place. And you have Reverend Parris encouraging you to tattle on anything you saw. Another huge thing that factored in was in 1684, King Charles II revoked the Mass Bay Royal Charter. So now the people weren't even sure if they legally owned their land. This was because some of the rules of the charter were broken, specifically making laws based on religious beliefs, and that's why they left England in the first place. In 1691, a newer charter was drawn up. I'm saying this, they were still trying to figure out laws, and the fear and the uncertainty they all live with, and they were doing this all with the logic of a 17th century Puritan. These people lived on the frontier, and they just went through a smallpox outbreak that just ran through the village, which, side note, I'm going to talk about Cotton Mathers in a bit, and he blamed one of the accused, Martha Carrier, of starting the outbreak because of witchcraft, I guess. On top of that, the villagers had to deal with the threat of attacks from Native Americans that could happen at any time. This was right after King Philip's War, which I'll be covering soon. It's just a bloody, gruesome time. Refugees trying to escape King William's War, French attacks. Just super turbulent time. Land being a huge factor, too. Everyone was fighting over who got what. Constant land disputes were in court. So it all started in January 1692 in Reverend Samuel Parris's house, when Abigail Williams, who was Parris's orphaned 11-year-old niece, and Elizabeth Betty Parris, who was Reverend Parris's 9-year-old daughter, started having mysterious fits. They were screaming, thrashing in bed, throwing things. It sounds like a weird tantrum. And remember, this is a time when children were taught to basically be silent. Do your chores, practice religion, don't talk. That's it. So the Reverend brought the girls to the only doctor in town, Dr. William Griggs, where they were diagnosed as being under an evil hand. So the town took that to mean bewitchment, of course. And this was the town's biggest fear come to fruition. Strangely, Elizabeth and Abigail's friends, 9 of them, started suffering the same symptoms as well. Two of them being Elizabeth Hubbard and Ann Putnam Jr., and they were both part of prominent families in the town. And they're probably the most recognizable names besides Abigail Williams and Elizabeth Parris as accusers in the trials. Reverend Parris, before living in Salem Village, lived in Boston, Massachusetts, only moving to become the minister. And in Boston was where Cotton Mathers, a minister and a Harvard graduate, wrote about what being bewitched looks like. He described in his writing how the afflicted would act, and that spectrally the witches would appear to those afflicted. So, of course, Reverend Parris and the magistrate had to interrogate the girls that were being bewitched. They were trying to get more names of who was causing this. So when Reverend Samuel Parris asked, "Who torments you?" after a bit, the girls shouted, "Tituba." This was Reverend Parris's slave, who was interrogated, and just imagine how she was interrogated. A local woman had an idea. Let's have Tituba make a witch cake. A witch cake is a cake that they believed would identify those who consort with the devil. Witch hunters would start with rye meal, some ashes, and the afflicted person's urine. It would be made into a cake and then fed to a dog, which dogs at the time were seen as familiars, but they were said to be very close to the devil. And if the dog acted bewitched, it proved that there was a witch involved, and somehow the dog would let you know who. I don't know if they pointed. Don't ask any questions. It makes sense. So Tituba makes the bread with Elizabeth Parris's urine, which she was ordered to do. Some say she was beaten to do it, and because of this, she did. And this was now evidence of her being a witch. So when Reverend Parris found out that she made this cake, he beat her until she confessed to practicing witchcraft. Since she practiced witchcraft, they made her practice to exonerate herself. The witchcraft she had to practice, which to make her a witch, I can go in circles, but to them it was logical. To me, it makes no sense. But this was a town that, like I said, was superstitious, God-fearing, and all the witchcraft in their eyes was the devil's work. That was it. During Tituba's examination, she confessed that yes, she convened with a tall man she did not recognize. Also at that meeting was Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, and Tituba claimed that she was coerced by the two women into putting her name into the book, where she saw both of the Sarah's names already written, and they all agreed to do the devil's bidding as witches. Tituba also added that she saw 6 other names in the book, but she couldn't really read what those names were. Her confession just reinforced what people already thought. The devil was running rampant in the town. Both of the Sarahs were not very active in church, so this alone made them social pariahs, and the town thinking if they're morally weak, they're more susceptible to the devil. So Sarah Good, who was poor, and people complained that she relied on her neighbors. Sarah Osborne was well off financially, but she lived, I guess, scandalous for the time. After her husband passed away, she married her indentured servant. And to the town, this was like unacceptable. Tituba, we know, was an enslaved woman, but her ethnicity is said to be either Native American or South American. And Tituba would be the only one out of the 3 that would survive. She was sold off to another family, but nobody knows what happened to her after that. In March 1692, all 3 women, the 2 Sarahs and Tituba, were sent to Boston to be held until their trials. So now the village had to find the other 6 witches that were written in the book, because I guess being a witch is contagious. Still in March, everything is happening fast. The girls are accusing more and more people. They accused Sarah Good's daughter, who was Dorothy Good. She was accused by Ann Putnam, and she was thrown in jail for 9 months. The jail wasn't like what you would think of it today. It's basically a dungeon with water dripping down, rats running across, and you're chained to the wall. When Dorothy was accused, she was 4 years old. She was held for 9 months and suffered such psychological damage that her father basically said she went insane after that. Another one of the 4 accused by the girls this month were an elderly woman named Rebecca Nurse, who was 71 years old, Martha Corey, who was an elderly woman, an upstanding member of society, but she was opposed to the accusations flying around calling the girls a liar, so she's a witch. Rachel Clinton from Ipswich was also accused. The trials began in February 1692, and they basically went, are you a witch? If you said yes, you were executed. If you said no, they were like, well, that's what a witch would say, so it checks out. Which, I'm sorry, being a woman back then must have been tough enough without having the threat of these accusations looming over you. The girls now have another accuser with them. Mary Warren, a 17-year-old local girl who was a servant for the Proctor family, and she accused the woman of the house, Elizabeth Proctor, of witchcraft. Now we're in April. John Proctor spoke up for his wife, Elizabeth Proctor, and said, "My wife's not a witch." And they were like, "Hey, then you're a witch too." Sounds logical to me. John Proctor tried to write to the clergy in Boston, letting them know about the hysteria, just trying to get fair trials for himself, his wife, and everyone else. Sarah Cloy, who will later be the only sister to avoid the noose, spoke up for her sister Rebecca Nurse, even bringing a signed petition to release her, so Sarah was accused as well. Giles Corey, who was Martha Corey's husband, Giles, by the way, was 81 years old at the time. He went and said, "My wife is not a witch. This is crazy." So they were like, "Okay, so that means you're practicing witchcraft." Abigail Obbs, who just happened to be the same age as the girls accusing everyone, was accused. Bridget Bishop was accused. Now, this is all in the same month. Like I said, this moves really fast. Mary Warren, the servant girl from earlier, came forward and said, "Hey, actually, I was lying, and so were the other girls." So she was accused of witchcraft. The last person accused by the girls was in April 1692, and this was Minister George Burroughs, who just happened to owe money to the girls' family. Many of the accused were people marginalized by society and who were easy targets, and the number of people being named was growing daily. When the people were accused, they had public hearings, so the whole village was watching. And to get a conviction, there had to be a confession or 2 eyewitnesses. If you recall, Cotton Mathers wrote that witches can appear spectrally, which includes visions or dreams, which I don't know about you, but I've had some weird dreams in my life, and I can't imagine a court accepting a dream as evidence. So anyway, the court was like, okay, we should accept spectral evidence. So as long as they had 2 people corroborating this, like maybe the 2 teenage girls that started this whole thing, having this logic in the court, it made it pretty much impossible for someone to clear their own name. So the girls could accuse and tell the court they spectrally saw it, and boom, guilty. And if anyone argued against what the girls said, then they were accused too and put through the same. The spectral evidence, like I said, made it pretty much impossible to clear your name. The court was a joke. Hearings were held at the Reverend's house or sometimes at taverns. They also had something called the touch test. If someone was having a witch-induced fit, the accused was brought near the person, and if the afflicted person stopped after being near the person or touched them, that confirmed in the court's eyes that the person was a witch. But again, the town had such strong religious beliefs, like if milk soured, that's work of the devil. It's not the fact that there wasn't working fridges. The devil could be anywhere in their mind, so if someone saw a person in their dreams or in ghost form, they were a witch, and that was enough for guilt. England at this time got a new king, and that king appointed a new governor for Massachusetts. The governor was recommended by Cotton Mather's father, Increase Mathers. The new governor's name was William Phips. He had 0 experience in politics, by the way. In May, Phips, the new governor, arrived in Massachusetts, and hearing all about the witch trials, he created a court of oyer and terminer, or to hear and to decide. He was trying to make this semi-fair, I guess, although the float test was still being used, where the finger of an accused would be tied to the toe of the accused on the opposite side of their body, if that makes sense. And then they were put in water, and if they floated, they were a witch. And if they sunk, they were dead, but they weren't a witch. They were just like, my bad, sorry. The reason witches, in their eyes, could float is because they, quote, spurn the sacrament of baptism. So the witch would reject the water and be floating to the top. Governor Phips got right to work setting up the courts to try the accused that kept coming in. Up until now, they were just kind of public court of opinions, I guess you'd say. And the people were just sitting in jail or getting their property seized. But Phips was going to have the accused go through criminal trials. So Governor Phips quickly chose the judges. William Staunton, I've seen both, was appointed as the chief judge and prosecutor. His legal background, you ask? Oh, he had none. along with 8 other judges. Remember, this was under British law, so the penalty for a felony was death by hanging. So in June, Salem decided to use that. The first trial being Bridget Bishop. On June 8th, she was convicted by spectral evidence, the belief being that the devil can only copy your appearance if you allow it, and she was being sentenced to hang. 2 days later, her sentence was carried out. The hanging happened at what's known as Proctor's Ledge, which is located at the base of Gallows Hill, because the whole town could see it from there. I guess it's to scare the town folk, but how much more fear do you need? Neighbors, family members, everyone was turning on everyone. And a ladder would be brought to the tree where the condemned would climb the ladder. A noose would be tied around the person's neck, and the other end of the rope would be tied to the tree. They would be pushed off the ladder where they would be slowly strangled. It's not like a neck snapping like you'd see in movies. They slowly strangled. Right after this execution, one of the judges, Nathaniel Stalenstall, was so disgusted at how the trial was handled that he quit the court. He thought it was ridiculous that spectral evidence given by 2 young girls at that was used to convict this woman. Another judge's brother-in-law took his seat, Judge John Corwin, and his nephew happened to be the sheriff, George Corwin, who was the person that was seizing all the land and property of the accused. You heard that, the accused. Even if you were found innocent, you weren't getting your stuff back. Some of the accused were dying in jail, so Increase Mathers was like, all right, let's speed up the trials and maybe don't use spectral evidence. So the court was like, all right, speed up the trial and just ignore the second part. So on July 19th, 1692, 5 more that were convicted were hanged. On August 19th, 5 more were scheduled to the same fate. This time there were 4 men, 1 woman. One of the victims was Reverend George Burroughs. If you remember, he was one of the former reverends of the town. Increase Mathers came from Boston to witness the hanging. Reverend Burrough, whose side note, his 6th great-grandson was Walt Disney. It has nothing to do with anything, but just thought I'd throw that in there. Was the first scheduled of the day, and Reverend Burroughs refused to enter a plea. So the 2 routes the accused could take is to lie and name other people, and you might be able to buy yourself a few months, but you'll go to hell because you just lied, which is a cardinal sin. Or you could keep telling the truth and allow yourself to succumb to this farce of a court system, but that wouldn't hinder your religious salvation, and you'd go to heaven. So Reverend Burroughs was first up to be executed, and as he was being led to his death, he recited the Lord's Prayer. According to Salem logic, someone practicing witchcraft could not recite the Lord's Prayer without any mistakes. So the community was shocked. So Increase Mathers was like, hey, that was done too well. Must be a devil's trick. So the hanging proceeded, and all of the 5 scheduled were hung, with the last of the day being John Proctor, who was a church-going family man who spoke up for his wife, and he's the one that wrote to the Boston clergy to help him try to get a fair trial, but they didn't respond in time. Some accused took their fate into their own hands. Philip and Mary English, who were jailed in Boston, were waiting for trial, but because he was rich during those days, he could just leave jail for the day. And one day, with the help of 2 ministers, the couple fled to New York, leaving their daughter with a friend, saving themselves. September 17th, Giles Corey, who was accused of being a wizard, he was the husband of Martha Corey, another accused, who was brought before the court where he refused to enter a plea because he figured either way he's going to be killed, using the Salem logic that they're using. So if he entered a plea, his property would be seized. But if he didn't enter a plea, he couldn't be tried, therefore his assets could not be seized. The court did not like this, so he was ordered to be pressed until he entered a plea. Pressing is when the victim lay naked on their back with a board placed on top, and then rocks or stones are added, increasing the pressure, and the pain increased until the person confesses. But Giles Corey, who remember 81 at the time, maintained no plea, so his kids could get his inheritance. And the person that was in charge of this torture was the sheriff, the same person who seized all the assets of the accused. The sheriff would go to Giles and ask, how do you plea? And Giles Corey's answer would always be the same, more weight. This continued until 2 days later when he succumbed to the torture and died. It said his dying words were, damn you, sheriff, I curse you and Salem. A few years later, the sheriff died of a heart attack, and for over 300 years, the sheriff of the town has always suffered a similar fate. whether it be a heart condition, dying during office, or a blood-related disease. 3 days after Giles Corey's death, 8 more were hanged for witchcraft, including Martha Corey, who was Giles Corey's wife. The total number was roughly 200 accused of witchcraft, between 140 and 150 arrests. 13 women and 6 men were all hung to death, and 1 being killed by pressing, while others died in jail just waiting their trial. And 2 dogs were even killed. 1 girl in Andover claimed her neighbor's dog was trying to bewitch her, so he was shot. And another girl in Salem Village claimed a man tormented a dog with his spirit, and that dog was shot as well. Then someone got accused that ended this madness. Mary Spencer Hall was accused of witchcraft and arrested. The problem with accusing her was that she was the governor's wife. October 12, 1692, the trial stopped per the order of Governor Phipps. On October 29th, Phipps no longer allowed anyone to be arrested for witchcraft and started releasing a bunch of those imprisoned, including his wife, Mary Spencer Hall. It took until May 1693 to release all of the remaining, ending this horrendous part of American history. He disbanded the court and banned any and all writing about the trial. And suddenly, when accusing someone of witchcraft became illegal, all the girls' fits and ailments and accusations stopped. In 1702, the General Court found that all the trials in 1692 were illegal, and people started petitioning to clear their names, and some were. In 1706, Ann Putnam Jr., now an adult, realized what she did and gave a public apology. In 1711, the General Court passed a bill restoring the good name of the accused and paying some restitution. I guess that's a good gesture. Some of the families did not want to be named, and the court complied. In 1957, over 250 years later, the legislature of Massachusetts apologized for the events in amending that bill on October 31st, 2001, to include the people that did not have their names already listed. There's a lot of theories as to what actually caused this hysterical part of history. Some say family rivalries, economic hardships, unusually cold weather, Lyme disease, encephalitis, conversion disorder, epilepsy. Could have been the time period alone. The girls were taught to be silent, unseen, and when a claim was made, everybody was looking at them. Everyone wanted to talk to them. They were the center of attention in courts or walking down the street. The most common theory I hear is that wheat has gone through a late frost, which caused a fungus to grow, resulting in ergot poisoning, which can cause hallucinations, convulsive fits, paranoia. And when the next harvest came in the spring of 1693, a dry season, everything went back to normal. Some people doubt this theory because if this was the case, how come only a few people suffered, not the whole town? And if the farmers are really familiar with plants, you think they'd notice if something was growing on their plants? The most logical explanation to me, I wasn't there, was outside influence. Look at Ann Putnam Jr. Everyone she accused was either beneficial to her or her family or an enemy of her family. Maybe this combined with the stress of the time, living in such a turbulent time with a lot of people just having seen the effects of King Philip's War. In 1992, the 300th anniversary of these tragic events, a park in Salem and a memorial in Danvers were dedicated to commemorate the murders because Danvers now is where Salem Village was. In 1752, it was renamed. Most of the victims of the trial were not given proper graves. Only 2 were, and that's because the families went back and grabbed their bodies. Rebecca Nurse and George Jacobs were the only 2 with marked graves. What's there now is an enclosure with benches, and at the memorial, the benches act as tombstones. Some of the memorial is a fence, not a wall, so that the people responsible who are buried in graves on the other side can look in and see what they've done for eternity. I have pictures I went and took, and I'm going to be posting those as well so you can see what it looks like. It's a really intense area. In 2017, Proctor's Ledge Memorial was dedicated to the victims, once it was confirmed to be the correct area, as a reminder of the people who lost their lives due to mass hysteria. So basically, don't fear witches, fear the people that murder them, and fuck those bored little brats. Well, thank you guys so much for listening. And again, I appreciate any constructive criticism, but please still don't make me cry. Thanks. Bye.
On the Mortal Musings podcast, we like to take the cases seriously, but not ourselves. Each week on the Mortal Musings podcast, your hosts Neil and Megan get into either a true crime case or a truly macabre story, followed by a strange and interesting tale of oddity. Join us as we venture into the dark and disturbing world of the Mortal Musings. New episodes every Wednesday, available wherever you get your podcasts.